দুটো অংশ থাকছে। প্রথম অংশে প্রফেসর জুলিয়ার লিটনার ওনার বক্তব্য দেবেন এবং তারপর আমাদের সঙ্গে একটা পুরস্কার বিতরণী অনুষ্ঠান আছে। তারপরে দ্বিতীয় পর্বে আমাদের সাংস্কৃতিক অনুষ্ঠান শুরু হবে। I'll just give a brief introduction on Professor Julius Littner, who is serving as the present chairman of the Indian Cultural Society. Julius was born and brought up in India and did his earlier studies in India until he was 26 when he moved to Cambridge for doing a PhD. He ended up doing finishing his PhD and joined the department as a researcher in Hinduism and comparative religion. He served for over 40 years in Cambridge and now he is a professor in Hinduism and comparative religion in the University of Cambridge. He also received, he was elected as a fellow in the British Academy earlier. So it's my unique pleasure to invite Professor Julius Littner to give his insights on Hinduism. Professor Julius Littner. And just to remind you that after the speech, Professor Julius Littner has kindly agreed to distribute the prizes of the painting competition as well. Thank you.
Good evening. Good evening, everybody, and thank you for being here. I want to thank Rajiv for his kind introduction. Can you hear me at the back? And my objective today is to give you a brief lecture on the meaning of pujo, on the meaning of the images. There is a great deal of excitement and joy and happiness here on this occasion, quite rightly. But under the surface, behind the scenes, what is going on? What is the thinking from the Hindu Shastras about what we are doing today? And I think that this will give some meaning, some depth to our celebration today. Now, image worship, just a few words about the worship of images. Pratima Puja, Vigraha Puja. I will give all the pronunciations in Sanskrit. So, Vigraha, not Vigraho, as we say in Bengali. Pratima Puja, Murti Puja, Vigraha Puja. Where does it come from? In the Indian subcontinent, in the Hindu Dharma, the Hindu tradition. How far back does it go? Culminating in the kind of murtis or vigrahas you see before you today. You know that the standard scriptures of the Hindus is the Veda, the Veda. And scholars date by scholarship the kind of language of the Veda, the kind of references in the Veda. The Veda is dated to about earliest section of the Veda, 1900 BC. Not earlier, 1900 BC. In the earlier sections of the Veda, the Samhitas, the Brahmanas, the Aranyakas, almost no mention of image worship, Pratima Puja, Vigraha Puja. One or two texts in the Vedas scholars are fighting about, is that a Vigraha, mention of Vigraha, Pratima or Murti or not? And there's no agreement. So almost no mention in the Veda. Till you come to the Upanishads, about 900 BC. There may be a few references in the Upanishads to something like Pratima Puja. But today we see Pratima Puja everywhere in Hinduism. So where did it come from? You know that you have heard of the Indus civilization in the northwest of India, the great civilization of the subcontinent. That is called the first urbanization of India, because there were cities and towns in the Indus civilization, and the peak period of the Indus civilization is 2300 BC. However, we cannot decode or decipher the language of that civilization. We have deciphered the language of the ancient Mesopotamian civilization, the ancient Egyptian civilization. We cannot decipher the pictographic script of the Indus civilization. One of the great enigmas, the great puzzles of archaeology and civilization right up to the present day. If any of you can decipher the script of the Indus civilization, you will be famous and very rich at the same time. So far we have not managed. However, we have found archaeologically artifacts left behind by that civilization. No temples. There are buildings, but no temples. No scholar agrees that there is a temple in that civilization. And there are a few figurines, there are a few small statues of female figures, and the scholars are still doubting whether these are toys or statues of a deity, a goddess. You can see how sparse, how scanty our knowledge is of ancient Indian civilization. What we have seemed to have found in that civilization is something like Shiv Linga. At the later end of that civilization, even that is not very clear. But Vishnu, Shiva, the headline deities of the most Hindus today, no mention. 1,000 years have to pass. Up to about 500 BC, it is called the second urbanization period of India, where you begin to have evidence for the construction of pratimas, of images, of murtis. So what happened for that 1,000 years between the first urbanization of the Indus civilization and the second urbanization of 500 BC? We don't know. The second urbanization, one of the main focal points of that civilization was in the Mathura area, Mathura, because it was in the middle of trade routes from the northwest to the south. So there you would expect to find an industry because of the trade route of image worship and so on, of images. And it is from about 500 BC that you begin to have clear evidence of Vishnu Murtis, Shiva Murtis, Mahadevi Murtis. Only 500 BC. And our own Dilip Chakrabarti, who could not be here today, colleague in the University of Cambridge and who comes here sometimes, he has written one or two important, he's a well-known distinguished archaeologist, he has written one or two important articles where archaeologically they have discovered the earliest temples of stone 300-200 BC. But before that we have textual evidence that there were murtis, pratimas, vigrahas, images from Panini's Ashtadhyayi, where they speak of Archa, Archavan. Archa, you know, is the consecrated image. But we have no idea of what the thinking was behind that kind of worship. And you have to get to 500 AD in texts like the Vishnu Dharmottara Purana, 500-600 AD, where for the first time you have some philosophical explanation, some understanding of what is going on. Ki hocche, orthotaki, what is the meaning of this? 500 AD. It doesn't mean that people were not thinking the same way before, but it is written down round about 500 AD, Vishnu Dharmottara Purana. And I will read you a text which I translated from the Sanskrit of the Vishnu Dharmottara Purana to explain what is going on in this kind of puja, what kind of thinking by the Hindus were going on. This is taken from chapter 108 of the third khanda, the third part of the Vishnu Dharmottara Purana. It's a very fat Purana, very big Purana. And the sage Markandeya is talking to the king Vajra. So Vajra is asking the rishi, the sage, there is no world in which Janardana does not exist. Janardana exists in every world. Vishnu Dharmottara Purana, so it's a Vaishnava Purana. So the name of God here in this Purana is Vaishnava. Janardana, Vishnu, and so on. And Vajra is saying there is no world in which Janardana does not exist. For by that great self, Mahatmana, by that great self, both being and non-being are pervaded. So what is the point of invoking the God, Avahanena, of invoking the God to come in and occupy the murti? Janardana exists everywhere. Why do the Purohits invoke God to come to the murti? And Markandeya answers, just as all the gods have images that are condensed, Pindita Murti, condensed images from the 5 elements of air, earth, water through the image, Vishnu also becomes such when he manifests as an image. So here you are beginning to get for the first time the philosophy underlying Murti Puja. Markandeya continues, every image derives from the Panchabhuta, the 5 elements, and it becomes Pindita, condensed, a lump. We can see that in front of us. Every murti has a middle, a beginning, and an end. You make it, it exists, and then it is destroyed. So, when you call Vishnu Sannihita, he is close at hand. So the aim of the murti is to make this omnipresent Vishnu close at hand. It's a very fundamental insight, but I'll say more about it after. He's not a distant God. He's not an invisible God. Out of God's gracious kindness, Saulabhya, out of his kindness, he comes close at hand. Markandeya continues, God has 2 kinds of form, higher and lower, para, apara. The higher is his personal form, and it is not Pindita, it is not Panchabhuta, it is spiritual. When he is in that form, he is omnipresent. And without that form, nothing in the world can exist. But when he comes as an image, he has a beginning, a middle, and an end in the image. He makes himself vulnerable to us. Just see the kind of God, omnipresent, all-powerful in his higher form. But when he comes in an image, he becomes close to us, Sannihita, and he becomes vulnerable to us. The humility of God. Whenever the Lord of the world, Jagadishvara, who is everywhere and always everywhere, is summoned in the image, Avahanena, by the Purohit, the reason for this is Bhakta Anugraha Karanat, for the sake of the love of the worshipper. Otherwise, why should God come as an image? He who is everywhere and has everything. It is out of gracious compassion and condescension for us, the worshipper. This is one of the earliest texts explaining the philosophy of Hindu image worship. He approves of the image, archam is the word used, solely for the satisfaction of the devotion of the worshipper. Kevalam bhakti tushti artham. And that is why he has agreed to come in the form of an image. And he makes one more point which you will all understand. Markandeya continues, it is difficult to be attached, lagna, to a target, lakshya, loko, that has no form, nirakara. But it is easy to be attached to a lakshya, a target, which has form, sakara. The image has form. It is easier for us to approach the transcendent, omnipresent, invisible, all-powerful God through this lakshya, through this target, than it is directly. Because then he has nirakara, he has no form. So see how condescending, how gracious God is in the thinking of these Hindu philosophers. Now we begin to understand a little more what is the purpose of image worship according to the philosophers who are behind this whole practice. And then he finally concludes, so the wise person, because you want to get your target, you have to go by sakara target before you get to nirakara target. So that is a wise man. The wise pursue and summon, call, avahana, and worship, puja. The word puja is used by images through the grace of the self. Atma Anugraha Karana. If you do this worship for personal gain, you will be in karma and rebirth. But if you do it without selfish motive, nishkamena, it leads to liberation, moksha. So even this image worship can be done for personal gain. It's very good, it's not bad. Only you will have to be reborn till you purify yourself. For real Atma Unnati, for real progress of spiritual progress, it must be done without need of personal gain. Then you can get moksha. But both are good. One is better than the other. Okay, so here is one of the earliest texts in the Hindu Dharma, from the Vishnu Dharmottara Purana, 3rd Khanda, chapter 108, giving the philosophy of image worship, 5th, 6th century AD. And the 2 points we have to make there is, God is omnipotent, omnipresent, invisible, higher form, difficult target. You want to first attain God, you want an easier target, and that is through the moon. Okay? That's a very, very clear teaching. Now this kind of puja, Durga Puja, as we celebrate it, in history the earliest reference to it is about 1750, 1780. During British rule, this is when it happened. And if you look at the newspapers in the 19th century, the 1810, 1820, all the Bengali and the English newspapers of Kolkata, because this is basically a Kolkata Bengali form of worship, you will see that the pujas at that time were to display wealth and power by rich individuals. It was not Shorvajani. We are celebrating Shorvajani. Shorvajani means for everybody. But in the 1800s and 1820s, the puja of Shobha with the Dev family were grand affairs, and the newspapers show that the British high society were competing for invitations to attend those pujas, because British policy at that time was much more relaxed with regard to the Indians that they were ruling. So there was, as the paper says, a clamor for invitations to attend Navakrishna Dev and his grandson's pujas in Shoabazar by the British High Society. And at that time there was music, dancing girls, acrobats, magicians, theatre performances, and khawa, feeding on a grand scale. So what we are doing here, the Samskriti, the cultural practice, is not new, because that was part of the original Durga Puja in Shoabazar. Only they had dancing girls and acrobats. So we have to develop our expertise a little more for those things. It was very much a social occasion. But by the 1830s, two things happened. The thinking was spreading in Calcutta among the Indians and the British that puja was a time for chutti, holiday. Because they had first 12 days everything closed down, then it was reduced to 10 days. So the concept of using pujas as a vacation period for the British and the Hindus and the Indians was established by about the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s. And many of the British went off to Shimla, Nainital, and so on, and other places. That was happening by the 1840s, 1850s. The second thing that was happening is a criticism of this kind of puja by the secularists, the rationalists, and others who said too much money is being wasted. They are wasting money, they should be spending this money on hospitals, on education, and on schools. Of course, this was one criticism, but it was growing in the press. And puja continued, but on a less grand scale in respect of this criticism. By the 1870s, the puja was politicized in the proto-nationalist movement. Because Surendranath Banerjee and so on in Bengal started the early nationalist movement about the 1870s, and the puja was drawn into that. And in the political agitation of the first partition of Bengal in 1905, the politicization of Ma Durga was very strong by the nationalists, the Garam Dal, the revolutionaries, and not the Naram Dal, the moderates. Okay? And some of them turned to a form of Durga, Kali, at the time of Durga Puja. Now I will read for you in Bengali first and then in English the kind of sentiments that were expressed in the political dimension of Durga Puja at that time, 1905, 1906, 1907. Then I will give a translation into English. But you need to hear it in Bengali to appreciate the cadence, to appreciate the power of the language. I wrote this very quickly in Bengali, so I may have to look carefully. Then the name of this article is Ma Nrityakali. Ma Nrityakali. Kal Brihaspatibar Mahalaya. Kal Omanishar Andhakar Sargamotto Chhaya Felibe. Ma Nrityakali Swayam Jaya Vijayar Hath Dhoriya Dakni Jogini Shankhini Digoke Sange Loiya Tandav Nach Nachiben. তাল বেতাল তারে তারি হুঙ্কার ছাড়িবে আর কাল ভৈরব প্রলয়ের ডঙ্কা বাজাইবে। চলো সেই নৃত্যকারীর সঙ্গে গিয়া আমরাও নাচি, দেখি মায়ের নৃমুণ্ড মালা কেমন দোলে, মায়ের রশি কেমন ঝলসিয়া ঝলসিয়া আধারে বিদ্যুৎ হানি। বাঙালি, তুমি আদরিণী শ্যামা মাকে ভালোবাসো, তুমি মায়ের অঞ্চলে লুকাইতে চাও, কিন্তু কাল মহালয়ের দিনে মা নৃত্যকারী পূজা করিতে হইবে। মা নৃত্যকারী রাঙ্গাচরণ পূজা রাঙ্গা ফুলে করিতে হয়। রাঙ্গা ফুল কোথা পাইবে? মায়ের চরণ রাঙ্গা, তোমার ভক্ত রক্ত রাঙ্গা, ওই রাঙ্গায় রাঙ্গায় মিশাইতে হইবে, রক্তারক্তি করিতে হইবে। মায়ের অঞ্চলে লুকাইয়া থাকিবার দিন ছড়িয়া গিয়াছে। জাগো জাগো মাথো, কাল মহালয়া। Okay, this is what was being said and sung in English translation during the Durga Puja of the first partition of Bengal, 1905, 1906, 1907. I want you to notice the adaptability of Durga Puja. This is unique in this dharma, in this religion. Let me give the English translation for those who cannot easily follow this stylized form of Bengali, so that everyone can appreciate the sentiments of that. I don't have much more to say after this. Tomorrow, Thursday, is Mahalaya. Tomorrow, the darkness of the new moon will cover heaven and earth. Mother Kali of the dance, Ma Nrityakali, herself will hold Jaya and Vijaya. These are female attendants of Durga. Jaya and Vijaya by the hand and dance frenziedly with her witches, sorceresses and she-devils. Tal and Betal will roar out the rhythm, and Shiva the terrible, Tal Bhairav, will sound the destruction of the world on his kettle drum. Come, let us dance too with the dancing Kali. Let us watch how Mother's garland of human skulls swings to and fro, how Mother's flashing scimitar emits lightning in the gloom. Bengali, you love your darling dark mother and seek refuge behind the hem of her cloth. But tomorrow on Mahalaya, you will have to worship Mother Kali of the dance. Tandava dance. Women usually do the Lasya kind of dance. Here a woman, Ma Kali, is doing the Tandava, the masculine kind of dance. Bengali, today abandon your gentle disposition and take on a fierce demeanor. Drunk with beholding the form of your beloved mother, sound the rhythm of destruction's dance with Tal and Betal. Dancing Mother Kali's reddened feet must be worshipped with red flowers. Where will you get red flowers? Mother's feet are red, and red your devoted blood. Mix red with red, you are to shed much blood together. You are to shed much blood together. The British don't like to read this sort of thing in 1995, 1996. That is why the author of this hymn was thrown in jail for sedition. It was a common sentiment of the time. And the Durga Puja was adaptable to these sentiments, different kinds of sentiments throughout the development of Durga Puja. This is the Saulabhya, the accessibility of God in our midst. This is the Suhitaka, the solidarity of God in our midst. This is the thinking behind this kind of imagery. The time to shelter behind the hem of Mother's loincloth has passed. Be inflamed. You must sound time's drum and dance the dance of destruction with Mother Kali. Jago, jago, awake, awake. Matho, madden yourselves. Tomorrow is Mahalaya. Okay? So Durga Puja has always been susceptible to the social and political circumstances of the time. Now you don't have to be a believer. You don't have to believe in a God or anything. If you are a believer, then this is the kind of God that is underlying image worship. If you're a non-believer, appreciate the power of the symbolism and the kind of God that you would want to worship. Not a distant God, but a God who is in our midst, part of our lives. Yesterday I was sitting there and watching the children playing and all the hoichoi and the putki and the moja and the fun and the games and the noise, the The Purohit is standing in front and doing his puja and arati and so on. People here are chatting, conversing. I thought, oh, that is right. That is the kind of God that the Bengali psyche and the Indian psyche, it is not only for this is for all different forms of Hinduism. Shaivism, Vaishnavism, Shakta. This is the Hindu psyche. The Indian psyche is worshipping God. A God who is in our midst. Eito Vastubik Visarjan. This is the real Visarjan of God. Amade Jivane Nodir Majkhane. Within the flow, the stream of our life, Ma Vishorjito Precha. She has been immersed. An accessible God. Part of our everyday lives. That is the symbolism of the God. And therefore, you are here, and the early texts say that this puja is for self-expression, this puja is for creativity. We see all that. The children singing and dancing, all the Sanskriti, all the stuff. That is how it should be. It's not new. That is in tune with the kind of philosophy underlying this worship. So you have to come here every year. You have to be part of the community. You have to express your solidarity. You don't have to be a believer. But you must be here because this is the only way it will continue for yourselves and for your children. There is so much more to say, but I don't want to say anything right now. I've got not much more time. I've already spoken for about half an hour. So perhaps next year I can say it. Thank you very much.